And and this is, as you may have just heard, recorded so that this can be shared widely for those who weren't able to attend today, or for folks that you think might enjoy today's session. Um, Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Kim Schultz, and I'm the Director of Interreligious Engagement and Public Projects here at CTS. Very happy, as always, to host our Wednesday gatherings that we hold bi-monthly here at CTS, an opportunity to come together, to learn, to celebrate, to be in community, to talk. And we are very happy today and honored today to welcome and honor 3 alumni womanist theologians with our session today that we're calling In Times Like These, Womanist Wisdom, Womanist Works. And I'm going to be passing it off to Dr. Joanne Terrell very shortly to lead us in this hour. And we're very excited for our guests, who I will also allow Dr. Terrell to introduce. But I will start us off as we do every time we meet, with a words of gathering, a moment of centering, a moment to bring us together and land us in this spot for our time together. And I'm going to offer the words of gathering today. We ask people to speak from their traditions, to speak from who they are in the world, how they were raised, so we can see the full diversity of our community. I myself was raised Christian in Minnesota on hot dish and modern Christian church band music. I was in a very liberal Lutheran church, although my grandparents were not. They were raised, and I attended a very not liberal church when I attended church with them. My dad and my mom were divorced early, and so I would sometimes attend my dad's church in Pittsburgh. And I remember one time when I attended his church, I was a child. They would come up and say, "Hello, Kim," somebody said, and what religion are you? And first of all, I think such an interesting question to ask a child. But I remember I responded, not knowing what else to say, saying, "I'm Christian." And oh, how they laughed and laughed. They said, "Honey, we're all Christian. What are you?" And I had to learn that the other word that I was supposed to say was Lutheran, but I didn't know the difference, honestly, at that age. And that story has always stuck with me. Honestly, I never could tell the difference. Fast forward to today, and I now know that we're not all Christian. We never have been. And in truth, I don't fully consider myself Christian anymore, but I do believe in a higher power. It just remains unnamed. We are in crisis in the world today. Maybe you've noticed. Perhaps you are as well, in your own smaller, more personal way. But sometimes, maybe more than sometimes, we need to pause and find joy in some of this wreckage around us. And so today, I hope that today provides that for you. And I also hope that this brief reflection from Black liturgies and its creator, writer, and poet Cole Arthur Riley resonates with you. It can feel foolish to pause and marvel at the stars when the world is burning, or to find the world beautiful when you've known it to betray you. But wonder is a liberation practice, a reminder that we contain more than tragedy. Beauty is our origin and our anchor. And now I am very honored to introduce our own Dr. Joanne Marie Terrell, Kenneth B. Smith Senior Professor of Public Ministry and Associate Professor of Theology, Ethics, and the Arts, to lead us today. Dr. Terrell, I pass it to you.
Thank you, Kim. At CTS, we've had the best success in attracting great students to do the heavy lifting that scholarship and Minds for Service demands. We have had and have a cadre of stellar womanist scholars known for their ability to think critically and creatively about our times and contexts. Today, we are celebrating the womanist wisdom and womanist work of 3 recent graduates, alumni who are making the agenda of creating a world where all people may flourish possible. Dr. Teresa L. Smallwood earned a Bachelor of Arts degree from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, a Juris Doctorate from North Carolina Central University School of Law, a Master of Divinity at Howard University School of Divinity, and the Doctor of Philosophy degree at the prestigious, phenomenal Chicago Theological Seminary. She is an ordained minister in the African Methodist Episcopal Church. With passion, conviction, and divine light from within, she is the James Franklin Kelly and Hope Eyster Kelly Associate Professor of Public Theology and Vice President and Dean of Academic Affairs at United Lutheran Seminary, Gettysburg and Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Today, we celebrate her and the womanist wisdom in her recent book published with Bloomsbury, Public Theology and Violent Rhetoric, examined in a queer womanist critical ethnography. Dr. Smallwood.
May I first say thank you so very much to you, Dr. Terrell, and to all of the professors there at Chicago Theological Seminary. I will never forget that my formation, my capacity to do critical thinking, my ability to really represent myself, my ontological being, was formed, it was born, and it was produced at Chicago Theological Seminary. I love CTS, and I will do everything in my power to continue to support the work there. Because Dr. Terrell, you are someone who I just revere, but there are so many others who have come through the walls and the channels there, and I just can never separate myself from that kind of love. Now I understand what it means when God says, there's nothing you can do to separate me from your love. Having said that, let me also say, Katie Geneva Cannon was introduced to me at CTS. It was through a sabbatical that Reverend Dr. and then Dean Emily M. Towns was having at CTS that kind of brought me closer to Dr. Cannon. And it was through a summer event where Dr. Cannon literally did a independent study with me that helped me really settle on the idea that I needed to do the work my soul must have. I studied with her over a summer and completed one of my ethics requirements. And in the process, really formalized what I believed would be my life's work. At that time, I had absolutely no knowledge of anything having to do with a discipline or sub-discipline of theology that I now call public theology. But what I did know was that I had been harmed by people utilizing the pulpit, the altar, the sacred space of God to literally disguise their so-called hate talk, or what I call hate talk, with what they called God talk. And that really had been my life's experience. I grew up, when you talk about interreligious experiences, my interreligious religiosity has taken a life of its own. I started out as a Baptist born into the Baptist faith. At a point in my life, I said, oh, I was born Baptist. I will live Baptist. I will die Baptist, all of that. But since that time, because of the harms that I felt, I exposed myself to other ways of thinking and believing. And the religious rationality that I finally end up with is not because I'm convinced that there is a perfect church, but what I am convinced of is my own strength to endure or to resist those structures, institutions, organisms that have a tendency to speak death and not life to me and people like me. And so what really motivated this work was the experiences I've had in various churches. I left my hometown, which was Windsor, North Carolina, to go to the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And when, in the process of my own undergraduate experience, we had what was called the Upendo Church. It was a combination of students from every walk of life, every denominational experience, and some that were non-denominational. And I participated in the gospel choir, what we call the BSM, or Black Student Movement Gospel Choir. And in that gospel choir were plenty of people who were LGBT. At that time, we didn't have Q and I and A and plus, but nonetheless, they were that. We knew they were that. I knew they were that. But because they participated in the choir, they could not say they were that. And that was curious to me. It wasn't until college that I really began to answer my own experience and to really live into my own love. But what I did know was that the church literally made people uncomfortable to be in their own skin. As I graduated, went on to law school, I saw that even more as I dipped into the AME Zion Church, ended up going to a non-denominational church. You will never believe what this name is. It was called the Soul Saving Station for Every Nation of the Christ Crusaders of America. Quite the non-denominational, but also very apostolic in its approach. And I did well in that church until I read its documents that said you had to sign off saying you're not LGBTQIA, whatever, LGBTQ at that time. So I left. In other words, I began to see this pattern, a pattern that I experienced. And I felt like perhaps there were others who had that same experience. By the time I actually put forth a proposal, and Dr. Lee Butler was my advisor, my primary advisor, it was very clear to me that there were folk who experienced the same thing. And so an ethnographic work became the sort of methodology that I used. At that point, then in walks Linda Thomas, Dr. Linda Thomas, an anthropologist, who took me under her wing and taught me through an independent study the whole corpus of ethnography. And at that point, I discovered Madison. Dr. Madison's work in critical ethnography showed me a different line altogether, which is to say, I wanted to do an ethnography that could change people's minds about what they were teaching and preaching. Now, I'm not sure I've accomplished that in this work, but what I do know is when I left CTS, I was confident in myself. And when I finally got someone to publish this book, I was sure the world needed it. Not only did it service my heart, my soul, but I felt by the time it actually came out in January of 2025, that this was timely work. And I know it to be true because of the ways in which this just absolutely autocratic regime we have in America, this so-called executive government that we see operating, trying essentially to divvy up humanity in a way that makes us all go back to times that none of us want to go back to. The effort that is being made in all of the executive orders and the ways in which people are being treated lets me know folk need something that they can put their hands on that says, no, God does love you. God cares about you. There was no mistake in your having been created. And what you are is exactly what God sees. God sees you. El Roi sees you and loves you. That's the purpose of the book. But in fact, the audience is any preacher out there who does what I call public theology. Anytime you stand before a crowd of people, it is a public oration. It is a public opportunity to meet people where they are. And if in fact the message that is being spoken is a message that makes people feel unloved, makes people feel uncomfortable, causes people to question their belief system, causes people to feel as though there is absolutely no place for them in the body of Christ, that then is my intent, to change your mind. And the folk that I have talked with help me understand very clearly that this is a problem. It is of epidemic proportion that people are still trying to hurt folks with their speech acts. And so I analyze those speech acts, and I take one particular person whose message was and still is on YouTube, that in my mind is one of the worst preaching moments I've ever heard. When I carried it to my focus group, they essentially ratified that conclusion. But I do so not to suggest that this man doesn't have preaching skills. He's a wonderful orator. But I do so to say and to acknowledge that there is another way to look at the scripture he claims to be exegeting. There is another way to take message from the book, and there is another way to apply it to one's life. If I had to say what the book does, I'd say that it answers my own need for a soulful reflection. It's at once a psalm of lament from me and my own experience, but it's also a psalm of thanksgiving and joy for the fact that you can actually go through these harmful experiences and come out all right. Now, some may say, well, what is all right? I will say it this way: God is not finished with me yet, but I'm very happy with the walk I'm on. I'll leave it there. I will put it in the chat how you can obtain the book, and I look forward to any questions that you might have.
Thank you very much, Dr. Smallwood. That was a very powerful opening to your presentation. I am just stunned by something you said, that the church made people feel uncomfortable in their own skins. And did you experience this as contradiction in the Black church and how did you navigate that contradictory feeling for the whole time that you were in the church and were aware of your sexuality being a thorn in the side of folk?
Hey, Dr. Terrell, in the beginning, I was like a lot of people. I just took it in as, I got to get myself right. That's why I ended up at a soul-saving station. I wanted somebody to wipe it off of me. I wanted to be cleansed of it because, hey, I'm gonna go to hell behind this, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But as I, get into college and I see more and more and more people and realize that everybody's trying to do the same thing, but there's something wrong about it because I know God speaks to me. I know I feel the presence of the Holy Spirit in my life. There is no doubt that I've been ordained to speak the word. So where's this contradiction coming from? Well, it took me a minute. I had to read Power in the Blood to understand, and to really, really break it down. There was a lot of deconstruction that had to happen.
Mm-hmm.
But then there was also a lot of construction that happened.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Well, thank you. Thank you so much. I just one more question from me, and then I'll turn it over to others who might have some questions too. How did your God concept evolve throughout your experience of your own embodied self, up to this present time?
So being taught how to really delve into the scripture was important. Coming through Howard University with Dr. Alton Pollard was significant. Reading people who had done biblical exegesis in a major way. You know, Alice Bellis in her book, dealing with the whole idea of what these she and he kinds of things mean when you look at the actual language. That helped. But it wasn't until I really began to open my eyes to the critical nature of the experience. Like this notion that this is not, it's not just me. You know, I'm not being singled out. This is a whole, they're relegating a whole group of people. And there's something wrong with that, right? And then I began to look at Jeremiah. I began to realize that, hey, the prophecies that have been spoken, the words that have been spoken, maybe you need to evaluate whether that's false prophecy. You know, isn't there something about the idea that people are being scattered away from the church, being told to, you don't belong here. Lock it up is what they told Quincy. Shut it down. You can get up there and preach, but don't ever tell folk who you are, really. And those experiences began to turn me back to the Bible itself. I'm not legalistic in that, all right? I don't have a legalistic approach. But once I began to see that it's not just in the Christian tradition, there are Muslims going through this. There are people who are from Hindu experiences going through this. And as I began to open the door to my own understanding and to increase my own consciousness, it became clear to me that, hey, there's something wrong with the way this is going down.
Thank you so much,
Absolutely.
Dr. Smallwood. So at this time, we're going to hear from our next speaker, and then I'll field a couple of questions, and then we'll move on to the next, and then we'll open it up for everyone to speak. So Melanie Jones Quarles earned a BA in Economics and Political Science from Howard University, a Master of Divinity with a certificate in Black Church Studies from Vanderbilt University Divinity School, and a Doctor of Philosophy degree in Ethics, Theology, and Culture with a concentration in Black Faith and Life at the illustrious, life-affirming Chicago Theological Seminary. She was ordained to the ministry at South Suburban Missionary Baptist Church in Harvey, Illinois, with brilliance, creativity, and a fierce commitment to enlivening a world where Black women and girls are whole and free. She is Assistant Professor of Ethics, Theology, and Culture, and the inaugural director of the Katie Geneva Cannon Center for Womanist Leadership at Union Presbyterian Seminary in Richmond, Virginia. Today, we celebrate her and the womanist wisdom in her book, Up Against a Crooked Gospel, Black Women's Bodies and the Politics of Redemption. We will hear from Dr. Melanie by video. That is ready.
Good afternoon. I am deeply grateful to my beloved alma mater for this gracious opportunity to feature my new book, Up Against a Crooked Gospel, Black Women's Bodies and the Politics of Redemption, published by Orbis Press. Chicago Theological Seminary remains a hallowed, sacred ground that helped nurture this book and cultivate many of my most and best intellectual ideas. I regret that I cannot join you virtually today, but thank the divine for the gift of technology to share this message with you on such a special occasion. I greet President Braxton, members of the Board of Trustees, faculty, staff, students, and friends who make CTS a place that continues to push the boundaries of theological education through greater justice in today's world. Justice does indeed live at CTS, but travels with its students and alums into the places and spaces where we serve and lead. I must begin my remarks by honoring my mentor, the moderator of this panel, my sage, priest, and affectionately Dr. Mutter, the Reverend Dr. Joanne Marie Terrell. I am uniquely gifted to be a millennial, fourth wave womanist scholar trained by womanist academicians. I began my doctoral journey at CTS with an interest in African American religious history. I worked then with Dr. Julia Speller, who guided my coursework before the death of my maternal grandmother in my first year that shifted my project to ethics and theology. Dr. Terrell took the reins of my doctoral study during my comprehensive exams, and she believed in my work from the very beginning. As I write in my acknowledgments of the book, I wrote most of these chapters in true womanist fashion at Dr. Terrell's kitchen table, where we met every trip home to Chicago for several years while I taught away at Wright Divinity School and then Seminary of the Southwest, and where I currently teach at Union Presbyterian Seminary, where I have the privilege of teaching ethics and theology and leading the Katie Geneva Cannon Center for Womanist Leadership. Dr. Terrell nurtured this book as a patient midwife, coaching me through every difficult birthing pain while going above and beyond the call of duty of any academic advisor. Dr. Terrell's invitation to perform a theological body scan of my life and story motivated this project. From the kitchen table to the public square, thank you, Dr. Terrell, for teaching me to find meaning in loss that leads to life. I am incredibly humbled to be your student. I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge my beaming pride for my sister scholars, the Reverend Dr. Teresa Smallwood and the Reverend Dr. Jean Derricotte-Murphy, and the publications of their groundbreaking works. Dr. Smallwood provides a salient queer womanist theology for navigating toxic public rhetoric and the bully pulpit that often erases and demonizes queer voices and experiences. Dr. Murphy advances womanist perspectives in religion and art through opera with a hermeneutical exploration of a view from the balcony and a vision for restorative resistance. I too am grateful for your witness and for your work. Together, our publications represent the best of the womanist tradition and foreground exciting womanist futures. Now to my new book. After completing my Master of Divinity at Vanderbilt University Divinity School, often referred to as the School of the Prophets, I came to CTS with a nagging question. What does it mean to be a prophetic voice in a Black woman's body? Chicago Theological Seminary provided a rich interdisciplinary program that challenged me to explore my scholarly interests in embodiment through coursework and examinations in African American religious history, sacred texts, Black aesthetics, philosophy, and womanist theological ethics. When novelist Alice Walker defined the term womanist in her work In Search of Our Mother's Gardens, Womanist Prose in 1983, Black female religious scholars and leaders in the academy adopted Walker's four-part definition as a birthing ground to cultivate a theo-ethical vision toward survival against all manners of oppression. For those bold and daring Black women searching for a critically engaged academic dwelling place in the 1980s, rather than waiting on white feminists or male Black liberationists to open the door of inclusion, these women utilized their sociocultural realities, theological proclivities, and mother wit to lay the groundwork and build a solid foundation for a home of their own. The Womanist Theological Enterprise is now a more than 40-year-old collaborative discourse initiated by Black female theologians, ethicists, biblical scholars, historians, religious leaders, and laity who take seriously the survival and liberation of Black women. Womanist Works moves Black women's experiences from the margins to the center by confronting Black women's multidimensional oppression while calling for critical reformation and careful ethical practice that resists all forms of oppression. Thus, womanism is an audacious endeavor that engages Black women at its radically subjective center and involves all persons seeking justice. 40 years later, the question remains, what wisdom does the womanist prophetic voice offer us today? America's domestically violent and compounding attacks against marginalized populations expose the ever-increasing need for critically engaged and ongoing research concerning the valuing of Black bodies and lives. In the 2013 CTS Challenge and Response, reflecting on the presence of the 5 womanist doctoral students at CTS at that time, including 3 of the women that are featured on this panel, I argued then that womanism jeopardizes its prophetic edge if and when it fails to translate its wisdom to Black church women who are desiring to subvert multi-layered oppression in their ecclesial communities and the world at large. Womanist thought must uphold its multi-dialogical, liturgical, and didactic intentions by fostering necessary exchange between the academy, church, and broader society. Budding womanist scholars are beckoned by our foremothers to advance the womanist prophetic call for truth-telling, wisdom-bearing, and justice-seeking in word and in deed. In my work, I turned to Black women's body politics. The Black female body, particularly as a site of multidimensional oppression, bears the weight of thick discursive inscriptions and marks a significant socio-religious history of terror and triumph deep within the fabric of this nation. To be Black and woman in America is to exist in the paradox of socio-political struggle and personal sexual entrapment. Thus, I contend that Black women's bodies and narratives are text that matter, producing materiality and meaning to confront fundamental assumptions and unjust norms within the intersecting spheres of religion and society. My work interrogates intersections of the sacred, social, and sensual in Black women's moral formation and how the political complexities of this crossway entrap and empower Black women's bodies and lives. Up Against a Crooked Gospel investigates Western philosophies and Christian theological constructions of body and flesh that often disavow Black women's full humanity as being made in the image of God. Critically engaging political scientist Melissa Harris Perry's conception of Black women existing in a crooked room due to negative stereotypes and pejorative assumptions, I argue that Black women face bendedness by multi-dimensional oppressions embedded in discursive inscriptions that bear both the metaphorical and the actual weight of forces levied against our bodies. America's white supremacist heteropatriarchal gaze toward the Black female body locates Black women in a crooked society that often misrecognizes and misjudges our moral character. Therefore, and moreover, Black women of faith face contempt from a Black church that has twisted its mission toward the business of saving Black women, producing a crooked gospel that mischaracterizes our virtue theologically. This book takes up the narrative of the woman in the Gospel of Luke 13 as ripe for womanist theoethical inquiry because it parallels with the historical and contemporary narratives of the Black female body bent multiple by pervasive threats seeking to stifle survival in a multi-traumatic world. My womanist reading of Luke 13, 10, and 17 engages the unnamed woman's bent body and liberation that uncovers the true crooked characters, the religious leaders, and the members of a socio-religious community who ultimately aim to suppress her liberation. The book takes up the works of Black religious and womanist scholars who emphasize a turn to embodiment as a central locus for studying Black faith and life. Through the perspective of my maternal grandmother's story as a Black migrant domestic and a critical analysis of Black women's salvation politics, I articulate Black women in mutual partnership with God possess matter mediated by their bodies that is necessary to confront a crooked moral fabric within the Black religion and the broader American society. In the words of Zora Neale Hurston, there is no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside of you. The womanist paradigm allows me to examine the cultural artifacts of undertold stories by tracing bodies to excavate hidden figures. My book seeks to interpret the story deep within the ravines of my ancestral lineage of my grandmother who suffered a bent condition alongside the Lucan narrative of the bent woman in efforts to confront a crooked moral fabric within America and Black religiosity that distorts Black women's character. For many years, I have grappled with the theoethical implications of my grandmother's story, her life, and her transition as paradigmatic for a broader social historical reality facing Black women. My maternal grandmother, Sweetie Gertrude Foster, was an everyday Black woman of faith who was a migrant, a domestic serving white families in the South. And then later when she moved to the North, she was a single motherhood working as a housekeeper at Hyatt hotels. I noticed that in the last quarter of her life, her osteoporosis bent her over. It came at her passing when I saw something profound happen. When she died, immediately her body, for the first time, laid straight. A reality that we had not seen in 25 years prior. This helped me to understand the possibility of divine transformation and liberation. But I write this book with a sincere hope for Black women that such transformation is possible for all of us in life and not in death. I come to this work with deep questions that are personal and theoethical. Who or what contributes to the more significant social phenomenon of Black women's bendedness in body and character, how might Black religious traditions be held responsible or accountable for such a bent condition? Is freedom for Black women in religion and society possible in life and death? And what does it mean for Black women to implore their bodies to incite such liberation?
No.
In many ways, this book opens up the possibility to not only engage the story of my grandmother, but much like the story of the doubly bent woman, I approach this work with a clear conviction that the bendedness Black women face is double-sided, with political damages in the American landscape and the spiritual hypocrisy that often exists in the Black church. I am calling in this work for a double healing that acknowledges the possibilities for Black women to live whole and free, that requires a confrontation that is necessary with the Black church and the larger society in order to contend with the forces that bend. Orbis Books notes this book mines the prophetic imaginations of influential womanist thinkers, crafting a liberating vision that resists serving as surrogate saviors in society and religion, while providing an essential text for students and scholars of womanist thought, ethics, biblical studies, and Black religion. Up Against a Cricket Gospel is a labor of legacy and love, belonging to my ancestors' wildest dreams, that makes a case for Black women's redemption and liberation in a crooked world with the help of God on our side. Thank you again to CTS for the opportunity to share a little bit about my work, and I hope that it becomes a resource for all. Thank you again.
Oh, thank you very much, Dr. Melanie Jones Quarles. We won't have her here, so we won't be able to ask her any questions, but if you have anything after we get to the end of this, we can probably field some questions about her presentation. Dr. Jean Derricotte-Murphy earned a Master of Theological Studies magna cum laude from Drew Theological School, the Doctor of Ministry degree from Ecumenical Theological Seminary, and the Doctor of Philosophy degree in Theology, Ethics, and the Arts from the world-renowned Citadel Chicago Theological Seminary. She was ordained to the ministry at the historic New Mount Zion Missionary Baptist Church in Detroit, Michigan, where she currently serves as Associate Minister, Assistant to the Pastor, and Director of the Worship and Arts Ministry. A world-renowned mezzo-soprano, she is a member of the Brazil Denard Chorale of Detroit, Michigan. Today we celebrate her and the womanist wisdom in her book, A View from the Balcony, Opera Through Womanist Eyes, Developing a Balcony Hermeneutic of Restorative Resistance, from Cascade Books. Dr. Derricotte-Murphy.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Dr. Terrell, for that introduction. And I hear people talking about me. I want to know, who is that? But I want to thank you for that. And I appreciate being on this panel with my sister scholar friends, Dr. Teresa Smallwood and Dr. Melanie Jones Quarles. We did sit together on numerous days in CTS, talking with one another about what we were doing and what we needed to do, and sharing a meal with one another. So this is absolutely a treat. And I come as one who has put a lot of hats on in my life. And we're talking about our religious backgrounds. And I heard Teresa say that I was born Baptist, bred Baptist, and will probably die Baptist. And that's probably going to be what will happen for me. I come from a long line of Baptist preachers, and believe it or not, I am the first ordained woman in this line of family ministry. But I don't take that lightly. I think that it is something that was intended. And as I look at the names on here, I see my cousin sitting on here, and I am grateful for him and his encouragement along the line as I've been traveling this journey. So CTS certainly was a place for me to begin to find myself and to begin to be more confident in who I was. And I came as a second wave womanist. Most people come a little later, but I came as a second wave because I actually was taught at the feet of Dolores S. Williams. So I came understanding womanist and womanist thought and womanist theology just a little bit differently than others who had to read about her, but I knew about it because I got it from her mouth. And how she nurtured me to become a scholar. And I wound up at CTS because I was sent there by the Reverend Dr. Marcia Foster. When I say sent, I do mean sent. She said to me, I know somebody who you need to work with. And she had the Reverend Dr. Joanne Marie Terrell in mind. So in essence, she just sent me over, and Dr. Terrell helped to continue my womanist walk so that I could become more rooted and grounded in what womanist thought actually was. And I met Dr. Terrell even before I got to CTS because there was a workshop at the Ecumenical Theological Seminary where we met one another and where she encouraged me to go ahead and put in my application. Then she said something to me. She said, but when you come, you're going to do everything I ask you to do, right? And I thought, oh my, I'm about to be in trouble since I don't know what she's going to ask. But what she did for me is something that I can only say thank you for. So Dr. Terrell, thank you for being my mentor, as Melanie said, the midwife, and as a friend, because I left CTS not just having you as my advisor, but knowing that you will be a lifelong friend. So coming to this book, there are a lot of other people at CTS who had a hand in getting it to the place where it was. I have to thank, even though she's not at CTS, but I have to thank Dr. Linda Thomas, because just like Teresa, I had a time with her when I was studying ethnology and ethnography and understanding what autoethnography was and realizing that might be something I can use in this research. And then there was Dr. Julia Speller, who helped me work through my original ideas because I was trying to work out how to find African retentions within certain things that we were doing as African Americans. And the more we talked about it, the more we thought about it, she just said, well, that's not really what you're trying to do. You're doing something different. You're doing something that looks at our history, but not so much our retentions. And then there was Dr. Lee Butler, who helped me to understand that more than just a theory that I was working on, I was actually working on developing a hermeneutic, which was amazing to me. How does one develop a hermeneutic? Well, here it comes. So a view from the balcony is actually the reworking of my dissertation. And it was originally intended as a countercultural narrative about how the Black female body has been historically perceived, particularly in the South during antebellum enslavement. My intention was to debunk the stereotypes about enslaved Black women as mammy, as incapable of human emotions, by showing the faith traditions, the tenacity, and the survival techniques and struggle for dignity and freedom of an enslaved people. And I did this by doing an analysis of the opera of Margaret Garnet, which showed the life of an enslaved mother and what she would do to go to no ends to ensure that her children, particularly her daughters, did not endure the same horrors of slavery that she did. So this book started out as just an analysis on an opera, but it morphed into more than that. So since theater is my background, And so it's just a natural approach to take this as though I'm sitting in a theater. And then I took myself to the balcony of the theater and realized, sitting in the balcony, you have opportunity to see the entire stage. Not only do you see the stage production, but you can also see all the people that are in the theater. And this became the analysis of looking at all of America as a theater and as a stage production, realizing that the players on the stage may be who we look at today as those in this theological theater, this political theater. I'm going to call it political antics, because it certainly looks like a play that somebody wrote, because it doesn't seem to be real. But we can look at the balcony. We can go to the balcony and take a view and say, I can see everything that you're doing. You're not fooling us. You're not hiding anything. We see you. Not only do we see you, but we resist what you are doing. We will push back. We will call ourselves balcony people. And from the balcony, we will make plans to resist what we see that is trying to harm and erase us. So I have to use the balcony of metaphor, and then I use the balcony of opera glasses. You know, the opera glass is a small binocular. You know, if you're sitting way up in the balcony, you really can't see the stage that well, but use your opera glasses. And then you can zoom in on individual vignettes happening on the stage. So right now, we're going to be using our opera glasses, our metaphoric opera glasses, to zoom in on all of these vignettes that are being thrown at us on the stage of American political life right now. And so if one of us takes an opera glass and we zoom in on, let's just say, Social Security, one of us zooms in on education, one of us zooms in on some other things that are going on, then together we become the balcony people who work toward resisting and reversing what we see going on. So in order to get to that, I realized I had to focus my research a little bit differently, because so many use the standard people for research. And in having a conversation with Dr. Linda Thomas, it's like, I have to do something different. So I focused my work on scholars of color as my primary sources. And it opened up a world that was just so rich. So I figured that these scholars actually decided they're going to come and sit at my table. So it was as if the scholars were just coming to sit at my table. And it started out with a scholar who Dr. Terrell introduced me to, Angel Ver Mvang, a Cameroonian theologian who coined the term anthropological poverty. And anthropological poverty describes just what has happened to Africans on the continent, as well as in the diaspora, by the stripping away of anything that allowed us to be human, taking our language, our culture, our cosmology, our art, our music, and stripping it away so that all that was left for us to see was whiteness, and how that damaged the psyches of those who have been affected by it. So it started from that point. And these scholars started showing up. African scholars, scholars from South America, scholars from America, Native American scholars, scholars from Asian American scholars started showing up and telling their stories about how their people were colonized. Sometimes we as African Americans think that we have had the worst experience and the worst history of what white colonization has done. Yeah, it was bad, but there are others who also suffered just as our people did. And these people began to come sit at my table and tell their story. So their stories are incorporated into the book. And they're giving a balcony view of history, which is different from an American view of history. It's a view of how colonization has affected their people. So one thing I've noticed that as each of these scholars began to tell their stories, one of the things that was a main theme throughout their story was how they indicted the church for its complicity in their colonization, not only in their colonization, but in the annihilation of their people and their way of life. And it was the church that seemed to be the common thread throughout each of their stories. And they took it a little further, and they explained that not just a church, but a specific document that the church used starting in 1493, in which it gave itself permission to go into all the world. And I say, steal, kill, and destroy. And this document is called the Doctrine of Discovery. And I realized that Americans, particularly American church people, don't know anything about a doctrine of discovery. They don't know the history of their own church. They don't know that it is rooted and grounded in what Dolores Williams called demonarchy. And so the demonarchy of the doctrine of discovery not only took root in 1493, but we are still dealing with it. We are looking at it now run rampant through the country. So we really need to take a look at the history and the tenets which this country was actually founded on. They like to tell us that it was founded on religious freedom. I think we need to rethink that, because it was not founded on that. It was founded on white supremacy. Enrique de Sel calls it political poverty and religious colonialism. Enrique de Sel, who passed during the writing of my work, was an Argentinian liberation theologian who also became the second grounding in the work as I was going forward, as he talked about the atrocities that took place for his people. Then there was Lily Mendoza. Lily Mendoza is from the Philippines. Now, most of us don't think about America as a colonizing country, but I had an opportunity to listen to Lily speak as she talked about what she had to go through in her country as a young person growing up, where she was chastised for speaking her native language, where she could not look at the arts and the religiosity of her people because everything had in essence been erased by the American missionaries. She's living today. So when we talk about colonialism, sometimes we think about it back in 1400s, 1500s, 1600s, but it is alive and well right now. And we have scholars among us who will tell their stories. Now, I realize that American history is reflected in the arts. And so because I've been a part of operas like Porgy and Bess or Harriet Tubman and Margaret Garner, I've seen and witnessed how difficult historical stories can be told on the stages of opera houses in ways that are not threatening. And this way we combat America's historical amnesia. We combat it because we put the stories in front of an audience of people who can sit and watch and not feel threatened, but yet we can learn a lesson about what our history is. So this book became a multi-pronged work, even more than I expected it to be. The first was it was intended to recognize the divine presence in all life, all art, and all people. The second was to tell the story of my enslaved ancestors, the women who thrived and survived despite their hardships. My paternal great enslaved grandmother, whose name I found while I was doing this research, and her name was Delphia. Realizing that these proto-womanists went before us, paved the way, and left a path for us to continue to walk on. The third was to keep history alive and tell it from the perspective of the colonized. The fourth was to show how opera can become an agent of change and resistance when it is staged as social drama. This way it has the ability to reorder, reorient, resist, and disrupt negative narratives about Black bodies, particularly about Black female bodies. Then I needed to create rituals to shift the gaze away from the single way of knowledge production, which was usually white, male, European. Knowledge production can come in many ways, and we found that using the scholars of color and using indigenous knowledge. And we had to offer ways to resist racism and xenophobia while restoring and healing the psyches of traumatized communities through what I call rituals of restorative resistance. And the last is to address the church in America and introduce her to her own history and remind her of her role in forming and perpetuating a racist nation. This is part autobiographical and it is part ethnographical, but together the stories hopefully will help us to recognize that what we're looking at now is not new. What we're experiencing now is not new. We have had ancestors go before us that made it through, and so will we. What I found most interesting is that as you are lifting these three books, that there are such connections between the three of them. And right now, I looked at a list of words that are being purged from the government's documents. And I realized if they were to read our books, they would probably redact half of the language that is in our books because it no longer fits their sensibilities. So these three books are under the, could be whitewashed if we allow it. And the analogy that I thought about was, if there is black paint or red paint on a wall and you want to make it white, you paint as many layers of white over that wall as you want to. You can even use primer or you can use that product called Kills, but eventually the color under the white paint will still bleed through. So it is impossible to whitewash all of history, because as we sit here, we will always be able to shine, even when they try to silence us and whitewash our voices. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you, thank you to our panelists. We have just a little time for a couple of questions. I don't want to take up the time asking my questions. I got lots of them, but go right ahead if you have a question. Raise your hand. Okay. Recognize you. Anyone with questions or comments?
Dr. Braxton, President Braxton, I see your hand is raised.
Yes, thank you very much. Dr. Smallwood, what insights, tools, and practices do you recommend for inculcating a self-reflective perspective on the power that preachers wield? And I will just say, for example, I have found great value in kind of desacralizing preaching and sitting it alongside other professions like medicine and law. And so in the first day of Introduction to Homiletics, I give the homiletic Hippocratic oath, do no harm.
Yes.
So I'm curious to hear you reflect on how you help preachers recognize the ethics of the profession.
I do so much thank you for that question. And actually, it was Dr. Terrell's work that really inspired me to ask questions of the text. So the idea that we would even question the theological grounding we all have comes to a real sort of intersection when you begin to think about how it is that some things just do not ring true. And so I began really to do meditation. I have my smokes. I experience oils. In other words, I reverted to a great deal of indigenous practices to come into my own. And every bit of it was holy. Every bit of it was holy. And once I was satisfied that people were not talking about the God I know, when I was satisfied that my own faith was legitimate and authentic, then it was clear to me that I needed to alert others. And so I certainly recommend having outside practices, disciplines that help you get clear on your own belief system. And once that happens, there isn't a devil in hell who can tell you that your witness is not true.
As I said in the chat, thank you. I am so eager to read your work. Great to have you with us.
Dr. Murphy, I was really impressed by your casting America as a spectacle. Just spectacle. And how do you see your work making an impact, perhaps in different contexts than America? For people who have experienced colonization, who continuously experience colonization, and how can we get this out there in the world for others to recognize and to embody a balcony kind of hermeneutics with respect to a perspective on their own context?
That's going to be a bit of a challenge because sometimes people don't realize that they're still living in a colonized space. So the only thing that I think we can do is just talk with people. It becomes a one-on-one, it becomes a group. We just have to introduce people to the fact that we are all living under the residuals of colonization across the world. And that is where I think that history comes in. It is important. I think it's so important for us to not only know our own history, but to know the history of all peoples. It makes a difference. And I sort of believe that if a certain generation had known the history from 1939, perhaps we would not find ourselves in this place right now. If they had understood what was going on in Nazi Germany as people from Germany and that particular Nazi ideology just marched themselves across Europe, if they had known that, things might be different. What helped me understand that it's important to know everybody's history is I have visited places where we consider them sacred historical sites. I have visited the Anne Frank House. I have visited Dachau in Germany. I have visited the slave castle in Ghana. We have to realize that history does not just belong to us, it belongs to the world. And when we are able to see each other's histories, sit in each other's histories, then I think we can help to spread what you asked, Dr. Terrell, how we can all recognize that this affects all of us. It's not just one story. It's a story it's a world story. And when the world story can be told, then I think we can come to a place where healing is possible.
Thank you so much. As Catherine said in the chat, this has been reconstructive theology at its best. Thank you so much.
Thank you to both of you for joining us and for all of you for joining us as well, and for your extra time today and for hanging on. We are very grateful for this conversation. If you haven't had a chance to look at the chat, please do. There are many thanks to both of our speakers today. One last note, and I promise I'll let you go. Yes, please let us applaud this conversation, President Braxton, and agreed. And thank you to Dr. Terrell. Very important and powerful, and we are very grateful for everyone's time. Just a note, if you want to join us on April 9th, our next Wednesday gathering virtually, we will be leading a threat and impact of current policy on LGBTQ plus communities. And I think that will be another important conversation. We hope that you will join us then. Unless there is anything else from the group that needs to be said for the good of the community, pause here for anybody. Then I thank you all very much for your time. Have a great afternoon.